Okay, welcome back. We're still in poverty, inequality, and discrimination, and now we're ready to start talking about discrimination. So, what are some facts? We're going to get to a table in the next slide, next two slides actually. First, definition. So, economic discrimination, the discrimination we're looking at is, are firms discriminating, and how we define this? Do equivalent factors of production, so do people who are equally productive to the firm receive different payments for equal contributions to output? So are people produce the same amount of output or contribute the same amount towards the output of a firm but receive different payments? Similarly, you could think of people who are receiving the same amount of money for different contributions, but this definition will be fine for us. Thing to note with this, if education and experience differences are driving these differences, then of course this isn't discrimination, right? We're looking at different payments for equal contributions to output, not when people are unequal in their what they bring to the table. So, what are some facts? Well, we're going to see some big differences between the demographic groups here, right? Both in 80 and 2005 here, white men versus non-white men versus white women versus non-white women. So huge differences in median income. More elaborate table that breaks out the weekly earnings based on occupation, right? CEOs versus lawyers versus physicians versus architects versus all of these various things. We see big differences between men and women in terms of weekly earnings. What we see actually is a 23% gap in wages. And often you hear of this wage gap. We're going to see a quote where we're going to hear this 77% in just a moment. So is this from discrimination? Well, the best way to test would be to see if you could test the productivity of each individual worker, right? If you could do that, it'd be very easy to test discrimination. But that's very, very difficult for any outsider to do. So discrimination can occur in other forms. What we're looking at is we are looking at the idea of discrimination from the firm level. Do want to make the caveat that discrimination could occur earlier in the chain, right? If you could have differences in wages, not because of the equal outputs to work once they're working, but you could have one person who's much better at math and one person who's not, because the person who's not as good as math was told, you shouldn't take math because that's not right for somebody like you. Well, that would be discrimination. It's not discrimination at the firm level, at the firm decision, but discrimination earlier in the process. There are other forms of discrimination. I do want you to keep that in mind. It's not what we're assessing in an economics class. The one thing that we can be pretty certain, though, these income differences we said, just showing those alone, that's not showing anything about discrimination at all. That's showing the median differences in salaries, but it's not showing whether there were any differences driving these median incomes. That's what we really need to see in order to know there's discrimination. So we're going to look at the economic theory, like what does our economic logic and some of these basic assumptions we've made, what does that tell us about what we would expect with discrimination? So the two main questions we're going to look at in this section. We're going to start with an assumption that you do have prejudice, right? That one group dislikes associating with another group. So we're going to start with the assumption that you have prejudice. If you do have it, would that lead to unequal pay for equal work? So that's question one. And two, how do our market forces get in the mix here? Do the market forces make things worse, or do they make things better, or do they just not matter at all? These are the two main questions that I will expect you to be able to answer when we are done with this particular section. This is an old quote that I'm showing you, but it's from a very important person. You could find similar quotes from people in the past decade, right? This is a 2002 article I'm about to show you. But almost nobody that we're going to show you has the importance of Hillary Clinton, who almost, was so close to becoming president in 2008. So she and this Rosa DeLauro, they sponsored what was called the Paycheck Fairness Act. So what do they say here, Clinton? At some point, simple justice demands that women receive equal pay for equal work. I can't think of a more un-American fact than that women are in any way discriminated against in the 21st century in the workforce. And DeLauro said, the wage gap leaves women shortchanged and undervalued to the tune of about 76 cents on the dollar. We saw it said 77 cents, but the 76, 77, 78, 79, those are probably the four numbers you'll hear most if you're hearing about the wage gap. What are these politicians implying, and then what is the reality? Two things. You may come up with, what are they implying? There's some debate here. I'll tell you what I think they're implying, and you could tell me whether you think you're disagreeing with them. You could give me feedback on that next time we chat. My interpretation is they think there is economic discrimination by firms, right? They're saying, I can't think of a more un-American fact that women are discriminated against in the workforce. So my interpretation is these two individuals are saying firms are paying women less than men for doing exactly the same work, both based on the quotes and by the term of this bill, the Paycheck Fairness Act. I think that's pretty reasonable to think that is what they're implying. They are trying to tell us that women are being paid less than men for the exact same jobs. What is the reality? That's what we're about to hit. So let's think, what is the reality? First, we're going to think to what's being told to us by economic theory, and then also what's actually happening based on statistics we find. So first, thought exercise. Think about this. You're a firm. You need to hire workers. And let's pretend the world described by Hillary Clinton and Rosa DeLauro is correct, that indeed an identically skilled woman who could lead to identical output is being paid 76 cents for a dollar, 76 cents for every dollar a man is being paid. Who are you going to hire? Well, if your only job is to maximize profits, you should be hiring women, right? Because you can hire them much cheaper. You could hire women for 76 cents on the dollar, or if you actually, as you'd go, if you hire African American women or Hispanic women, it could even be cheaper, right? Assuming the contribution to output is the same. And you do that not for the only reason you're doing this is you are maximizing profits, the assumption we base towards firms. Question we would ask is, if you are doing this, if you are exploiting the wage gap, assuming there is a wage gap, but if there was one and you are exploiting it, are you helping society or hurting society? And helping or hurting, there's some subjectivity, but we'll say, let's make the normative assumption that discrimination is bad, that unequal pay for equal work is a bad thing for society. Are you helping or hurting society by exploiting the wage gap? When I ask this in classes, most people tend to say, well, you're hurting society. I will say you're helping society, and you would be helping to decrease the amount of discrimination and, in fact, reduce it to nothing. And we'll see why in just a moment. So, you're a firm. All you care about is making as much money as you can make. So you're going to hire women instead of men because Hillary Clinton told you that women make much less than men make, right? I mean, this is common sense. You want to make money. You're not a bad person necessarily. You just want to make money. And you're going to hire the cheapest person you can hire that will produce for you. So you're going to hire only women if you're this firm, as they're less expensive to hire. However, let's start to think about demand and supply. What is that going to do to the demand for men and the demand for women in the workforce? Well, you're going to increase the demand for women, right? If you increase the demand for women, what is that going to do to the wage for women? Well, increase in demand increases the wage. That will decrease the demand for men. What is that going to do to the wage for men? Will decrease the wage for men. Wow. This is, as a firm, even though you don't care anything about equality whatsoever, all you care about is maximizing profits. If you're a firm that's all you care about, you are actually going to reduce the wage gap by your actions. right? By hiring women, you raise the wage for women, and by not hiring the men, you'd lower the wage for men, and they would become more equal. And in fact, other firms that are profit maximizing are going to do the exact same thing. If there's any gap, right? If a firm could save 5% on labor costs, don't you think they would do that? Of course they'd do that. The firms would hire whoever is cheaper. But by hiring who is cheaper, they'd raise the wage of whatever group is cheaper, and they'd lower the wage of the more expensive group. And in fact, this will go on until they're equal, because firms will exploit any gap they can exploit to make as much money as they can, to the point where wages are equal. So what does economic theory, if you allow free markets to work, we've talked about benefits of markets before in terms of efficiency, that people who most want the product get the product. Well, if you don't like discrimination, markets are also good for this. Because theory is telling us that firms are going to make sure there are no wage differences for equally productive people. That's a pretty powerful point, right? That free and unfettered markets where there's no interference, as long as the government stays out of the way, equally productive people will be paid equal amounts. I mean, that's huge. This is a very, very powerful finding. And to me, this is one of the kind of the more exciting things we find in microeconomics. Not only is there efficiency and lack of deadweight loss and all of that, but I don't want discrimination against, about anybody based on some fact that shouldn't be a factor, like, gender, age, race. I don't want discrimination for these things. Free markets help ensure there's no discrimination for these things. So what about this idea that you heard from Hillary Clinton, what about this wage gap? Well, that gap, that's median salaries. And we go back to these tables we saw big gaps, right? These are huge gaps in salaries. Those are median salaries. That's taking every male. What's the male in the middle earning? Take every female. What's the female in the middle earning? That isn't factoring in what type of job you have, which we know is a huge factor. We've already studied that that's a huge factor. Women are going into more fields that are lower paying fields. You even see that at Susquehanna University. The highest paying majors are the business majors. Well, Susquehanna University is 60% women approximately, but the business school is 60% men. You're going to see a wage gap at Susquehanna University, largely just because our graduating majors, more men are taking the fields that are going to pay more. So our majors are going to show differences in median income simply for that fact. So it doesn't take into choice. It also doesn't take into time out of the labor force, which is a huge factor. Women are far more likely to take time off of the labor force than men to raise children. Well, that time out, especially it's in the crucial years where wages are expanding, this is going to be part of the wage gap. So these differences that you heard of, those are median differences that you heard of from politicians. And it's not just these two politicians. You hear lots of politicians make this claim about a huge wage gap. But the important thing for us to learn here is this is not the result of firms that are doing nefarious things, the firms that are misbehaving and trying to discriminate against men or women, because firms have no incentive to do so. Firms want to make money. They want to hire whoever's cheaper, but by doing that, they'll ensure people who are equally productive are paid the same wage. So once analysts start to control for these ideas, like how long have you been, what schooling did you have? What job are you in? How long have you been working? Did you take time out of the workforce? All of these other factors. There's still some unexplained difference, but usually it's on the order of 1% to 2%, which I'm not saying that's a good thing. But this idea that there's a 23% difference in the wages for equally productive men and women is completely and totally ridiculous. If you go and look at what the federal government says, they aren't quite clear these are median incomes, but it's misinterpreted all over the place. That is just simply not true, that equally paid men and women are paid these huge differences, or equally paid minorities versus whites, or whatever groups you would like to think of. In the studies that have controlled for this, they found very small to no difference. And in fact, there's some studies that show women making more than men once you start to control for these various factors. So, reviewing, if a wage gap existed, what would happen? And I think trying to draw these demand and supply charts on your own would be good. We're going to go through this in just a moment. But profit maximizing firms are going to hire the cheaper workers. Wage for the cheaper workers go up. So you could draw two graphs. One, cheaper workers, more expensive workers. But what you should see is they'll converge if they're equally productive, because the wages for the more expensive workers drop, cheaper workers increase. And if you're in a sector of the economy with firms, and those firms maximize profits, it seems quite implausible that you're going to see any sort of wage gap. If you think there is a wage gap, you could become a millionaire really fast by going out and exploiting the wage gap, right? If you think that there's a group in the economy that's being paid less and they really do contribute the same, go out and hire only that group. There's two things that you're going to do that are good for society. One, you're going to become really rich for you, right? And for society, you're going to be decreasing that gap by raising the demand for the lower priced labor. So we do not see these differences in pay for the same job. The 77 cents on the dollar, it's the median difference in wages for all men and all women across all jobs, across all experience levels, et cetera, et cetera.